I'd like to ask how many of you have ever won a prize or a contest or something like that? What have you won? Oh, a trip to Hong Kong. I'm envious of that. Well, I am a fellow contest winner. Actually, in 1939, in February, I was awarded a 16-day luxury Caribbean cruise by Mr. Robert Ripley of the Believe It or Not Company. Now, this newspaper article here lists my name, Eddie Zula, along with the 13 other winners. But there's something curious about this newspaper article. If you could read this fine print carefully, you would see that everybody has an address. Rochester, New York, Pennsylvania, whatever, where they live. My address is listed as St. Vincent Charity Hospital, Cleveland, Ohio, not Elgin. Now, how did it come to be that my address, permanent address, was listed as a hospital room? Well, you have to go back 5 months prior to that to Labor Day, 1938. As a member of the Illinois National Guard and a parachute jumper, I was invited to attend the annual Cleveland National Air Races in Ohio. The morning we left Elgin, I kissed my wife, Rose, goodbye and joined the convoy. We were all excited to go because this was the place where all the best pilots of their time would attend and show their stuff. Jimmy Doolittle, Wiley Post were among the racers who flew down low among the pylons and thrilled the spectators. They had airship demonstrations, they had glider landings, landing contests, and of course, closest to my heart, they had parachute jumping competitions. But just because you attended did not mean that you got to jump. In fact, we had a system of ranking, and that system depended upon a lot of factors. The schedule, the weather, other events, and so maybe or maybe not you would get on the schedule. In fact, I was not scheduled to jump that day. Now, you might think that the danger in parachute jumping is the falling, but that's not the only factor. You see, if you jump from a high enough altitude, you can suffer frostbite in a serious case. And if you don't have enough oxygen or air pressure, you can black out. Not exactly the condition you want when pulling your ripcord is the secret to your surviving. And if your aircraft that you're going up in ascends too quickly, you can get a case of the bends, a condition commonly associated with underwater diving caused by too much nitrogen in your bloodstream. In fact, that day, one of my buddies did suffer the bends, and so as luck would have it, I was chosen to take his place. And my good luck it was, too, because I got $25 for that jump. Now, I didn't have my chute packed and ready, so I used his. We were a group of 30 flying in 3 Ford trimotor airplanes. Now, we took off and gradually ascended up to about 20,000 feet. I don't know if you know much about parachute jumping, but 20,000 feet is not exactly high altitude. It's only 600 feet higher than the Empire State Building. And so it's about the minimum you'd ever want to jump from. You know, here I am telling you about parachute jumping like it's some kind of a train ride. Let me step back a minute and correct that. Can you imagine the range of feelings that you get to experience when you're a jumper? Well, first you're sitting on the ground and you're relaxing, and you're having a good time. And then you get the call. We're jumping today. Great! Pack the chutes. We packed our own chutes back then. Now that relaxation turns to seriousness. You cannot pack a chute without knowing that every move you make is life important. You got to do it right. And so, even if it's already packed, you check it just to make sure. Just like you go back and you check the door to be sure you locked it, even though you know you did. Right. So, the group of us went up and ascended up there. And when we got on the airplane, you get the feeling of, should I go up front? Should I be the first to jump? Or if you're hesitant, maybe you want to hang back a little bit. Well, what am I hanging back for? I've done this a lot. But then your heart starts to pound. You ask a jumper, if you meet him in a bar and buy him a beer and get him to talk, have you ever been afraid? He'll say, probably, nah. Don't you believe it? That heart pounds, and it is so loud, and it won't stop, and you can hear it over the sound of the motors. And then, after liftoff, you experience a period of calm. Because you look out the open jump door, and you see that green earth slowly floating below you, and you know why you love this. Where'd that heartbeat go now? And then that fear changes to its very close cousin, euphoria. Yes, you can't wait to get up to that door, to jump out with your eyes and your mouth wide open. Ah! And then I felt the parachute cord around my leg, and the other one around my neck. I knew that in the best conditions, even with my chute open from 20,000 feet, I had 30 seconds to get it untangled. I tried. By the time I pulled my ripcord, I was 75 feet off the ground, and the witnesses said I bounced 4 to 5 feet. I can certify that. I was awake every minute. Did it hurt? Oh my God. It felt like I was being hit by a locomotive. The worst part was after I realized I was still alive, trying to get up. You can't move when you have 3 crushed vertebrae and a broken ankle and a broken shoulder. You sit there and your mind says, but nothing happens. It won't go. So that's how it came to be that 5 months later, when Ripley published this poster about me, that my address was St. Vincent Charity Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, I was still there. It took another year for me to fully recuperate and get back on my feet. I don't have my Rose anymore. But this reminds me of her. You know, the doctor said I should never live. That it was a miracle that I survived. But that wasn't the miracle. You know what the miracle was? My Rose was the miracle. Every day for 9 months, 6 months in that hospital in Cleveland, she was there by my side. And then for a full year back here in Elgin, she took care of me every day. Every day she made me do my exercises. Even though I wanted to give up and didn't want to, she forced me to. Until that final day and she helped me take those first steps on my own. And so, you go ahead, you believe in miracles, but be sure that if you want to believe in miracles, you have a rose, like I had, to make those miracles come true.
We're celebrating today the life of Dr. Benjamin Brown, who was the founder and first president of Judson College. Dr. Brown in 1960 was the president of the Northern Theological Seminary, and that had just moved from a changing neighborhood in Chicago to Lombard. And once it was settled in Lombard, Dr. Brown felt that the combination of an undergraduate college with a seminary was improper. So he was looking around for another location for the college. Dr. Willis Reed of Elgin knew Dr. Brown, and Dr. Reed also knew Mrs. Joel Duderman, who was the widow of a prominent Elgin surgeon. She was looking to sell her property, which consisted of 19 acres and was known as Braeburn on the Fox. She had already received an offer of $125,000 for the property, and Dr. Brown knew he could only afford $100,000. But she agreed to meet with him, and Dr. Brown said, "Mrs. Duderman, do you think your husband would prefer to have his property become the site of another restaurant and cocktail bar, or the location for a college that will train young Christian men and women to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, architects, social workers, to make this a better world?" And with that, Mrs. Duderman agreed to sell the property for $100,000. In 1963, exactly 50 years ago, Dr. Brown started Judson College. It was located on an area of 19 acres and had approximately 50 students. He served as president for 4 years and then retired due to a heart condition. He and his wife moved to California, and 9 years later he passed away. But his ties to Elgin were so strong that he wanted to be buried here. So his grave is on the east side of this cemetery, and I'm sure Dr. Brown would be very pleased to know that in 2007, Judson College became Judson University, and today has an area of 90 acres and a student body of approximately 1,100 people. In 1813, Adarian Judson became the first Baptist missionary to go from the United States to Burma, and it's in his honor that the college has its name. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. I was just relaxing a bit and indulging in some reminiscing, for I found one of my diaries, and I'm having a wonderful time recalling some events of my life. Do you keep a diary? Does your family have its history recorded? My grandson, Benjamin Yao, provided a 50-page history for his 3 granddaughters. What a labor of love. In it, he used some excerpts from my diaries and also used conversations from family members. Here's what he recorded about me. Mary Lib Stewart. In Mary's young days, she had many friends among the boys and girls of the neighborhood farms and the city of Elgin. She was vivacious, witty, and always the life of the party. These friends were still dear to her throughout her life. Mary was pretty coy about which of her male callers were actual boyfriends. At no time did she write her appraisal or feelings about anyone, much less her suitors. Well, I have a few entries I'd like to share from my diary with your permission. But first, a little background information. I was born October 27, 1846, to Phineas and Jane Smith. Father worked part-time at the Clintonville Quarry, hauling stone to be used for the construction of the Galena-Chicago Railroad. You know Clintonville today as South Elgin. He also operated the farm of Elgin's first mayor, Dr. Joseph Teft. In 1848, Father came down with a fever, as many did. No, not a physical fever, gold fever. He had high hopes of striking it rich in California. He left Mother to care for me and my brother and to work the farm. Well, later Mother told me a story about a conversation they had before he left, and I recorded that in my diary. Mother did not count much on Father coming back rich in gold, and one of her admonitions to him was, "Now, Phineas, if you do away with your overcoat in that warm climate, be sure not to sell your buttons. They're valuable." Eventually, Father reached California after many hardships on the trip, but he had no luck in striking it rich. He came back by boat around Cape Horn and landed at New York. Finally, he returned and handed over the buttons to Mother. That was all Father had to show for his adventure. When he returned, Father bought a dairy farm just east of Lord's Park. Father became a pioneer in the dairy industry, for he was the first to ship milk from Elgin to Chicago by railroad. Many said, "Oh, that can't be done. The milk will spoil before its arrival," but it didn't. He used a can such as this one. It wasn't long before our Chicago milk dealers looked to Elgin for its fresh milk. Elgin's dairy industry grew to huge proportions. Here's an entry about the first time I met Nanny. One day when Father was in Elgin, a train load was at the station and citizens were asked if they would take into their employ any of the people as servants or laborers. Father chose a little girl whose only garments was a gunny sack, a one-piece affair with the four corners cut off, leaving holes for arms and legs. The child said her name was Nanny Pride. We took her in, bathed and clothed her, and eventually taught her to read, write, cook, sew, and all proper housekeeping methods. You see, after the Civil War, many freed slaves, especially women and children, traveled north looking for jobs and a home. Railroad companies provided free transportation, but it was by no means luxurious. They traveled on flat cars. Can you imagine the courage it took to travel such a long distance, not knowing whether you would find a job or a home, unsure of how you would be received in a new place, and those poor children traveling so far? Well, Nanny stayed with us nearly 20 years. She even worked for me after I was married. She married a barber in Chicago and moved into the city. Nanny and I remained friends and remained in contact, though, for many years afterward. Angus. It was in October of 1875 that I married Angus Stewart. We were married 24 years and blessed with 4 children, 3 boys and 1 daughter. Angus had come from Montreal in 1863. He was a baker. He opened a bakery in town and later went into the real estate business, Stewart and Stockwell Real Estate. In 1881, he built Stewart Hall, a building on South Spring Street, just south of Chicago Street. I understand that building still stands today. You might go by and see it. April 15th, 1923. Angus died today after an illness of several weeks. His health had begun to fail in January already. God rest his soul. I will miss him terribly. Oh, Here's an entry I think you might enjoy if you have time. Do you have time for one more entry? Good, good. A little background. Elgin didn't have much luck with bridges crossing the Fox River. The first one, a wooden one, was built in 1837-38. It collapsed in 49 after a spring flood washed the dam and the bridge out. It was rebuilt, and then in 1866, an iron bridge was built to replace it. Well, it also collapsed a couple years later when 90 head of cattle stampeded the bridge. They weighed around 50 tons. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Some of the cattle did die, however. Butchers were called on the site to butcher those that hadn't survived. Needless to say, beef prices that day were quite reasonable. Well, I was involved in a bridge collapse also, and I'd like to read that to you today. A year later, July 4th, 1869. It was a beautiful, cool day. I went with a friend into town to watch a boat race from the Chicago Street Bridge. Had been there but 2 or 3 moments when the bridge gave way, and we, with between 80 and 100 people, were precipitated into the water. We got ourselves wading into the water up to our shoulders to the shore. My knee was cut and both shins scraped. Many more badly hurt, limbs broken and bruised in every way. One man, Mr. Tortolo, was fatally injured. One team went down. 6 persons were in the wagon, all more or less injured. One horse died in the water. By the way, the bridge collapsed again in 1881 after a very harsh winter, but that's a story for another day. I died on November 11th, 1934, after living 88 years. I had a wonderful life and many wonderful recollections. There is a lesson, though, to be learned here that I hope you take heed. Be very careful what you do and say in life, for those antics may be recorded in someone's family history. Please come again, and next time bring your diary to share so we can have more stories. Thank you for coming.
Some of you have probably never been back here to this very tucked away site. It's the 3rd burial site for some people. Back in the early days of Elgin, the first burial ground was approximately 2 football fields in size, side by side, located at Division and Chapel Street, right across from what we now know as the Synagogue and Holy Trinity Church, and where the Newman House or the Butterman's Club was located. One of the first people buried at that location was Mary Ann Kimball, one of Elgin's first settlers, but in 1847 she came to an untimely death at about the age, and I'm going to double check my notes, at age 26. It soon became obvious, though, that that cemetery was not going to be large enough for this fast-growing town of ours, and James T. Gifford in 1843 donated new land for a new cemetery over on Channing Street. They moved west, and families and loved ones of those that were buried at the original burial ground were informed of this change and were asked to move their loved ones to the new cemetery, a cemetery that was going to hold approximately 7,200 sites. There they had a potter's field, a section for contagious disease, and a large section for people who had died at the mental health hospital here. But lo and behold, it was soon discovered in 1888, even that cemetery was growing to be too small. And so the city fathers looked around again for land, and they found it eastward on a horse farm here at what we know as Bluff City Cemetery. All three of these cemeteries, when founded, were located outside of residential, commercial, retail area. People knew how people died, if it was by gunshot, by accident, or maybe by a hanging, but they didn't understand how people died with the passing of diseases. And so they always located cemeteries outside so people couldn't catch them too easily. Another reason why hospitals were located outside, and for those of you familiar with Elgin history, Sherman Hospital was located outside on Channing Street, and often early hospitals were called pest houses for the very same reason. Now, approximately 3,500 bodies were moved from Channing to this location, but the others were not, unclaimed, whatever reason. But in 1968, Channing School was going to be built in Channing Park, the old cemetery area. And while digging the foundation, remains were discovered. This was the time when government was not as particular about what happened to remains of bodies, and so the decision was simply to reinterm the remains at Bluff City Cemetery. They brought them here in trucks, and they were placed here in the common ground, which was only marked at that time by the existence of a large oak tree, which no longer stands today. In 1998, Channing School had an addition put on it, but rules and laws changed, and archaeologists were brought in to supervise the digging of the foundation, and remains were found, including Mary Ann Kimball. So here she came, along with others, to be placed in the unknown location of the common ground. It is the hope of the Elgin Area Historical Society to eventually place a monument here, designating and recognizing those that are are located in this unmarked location. They hope to do this through the collection of donations and what have you. So if any of you ever wish to participate in that way, keep your ears and eyes open for that program. We thank you for joining us here today at the Uncommon Burial Ground. I think you can just pass through.
I'm so humbled that you came by to meet me today. And I'm going to tell you a little something about me. My name is Polly Rutland. And I was born in Bertie County, North Carolina, around about 1796. Now, I don't know exactly the date, but that's what Massa Rutland told me. And I died November 16, 1888, at age 90 here in Elgin. Now, I was born a slave, and I stayed a slave a long time, 65 years, on Mr. Rutland's plantation. But I got out, and I got me on a train, and I came here north to this here Elgin in 1862 when I was 66 years old. We was called contraband because we escaped. We ran away from Mr. Rutland, from Massa Rutland and Missy Rutland, me and my daughters and some other women and children. Now let me think now. It was me and my daughter Minerva and my daughter Maria and Yes, Millie Oates and Margaret Hyde and their daughters and some other women and children, we all got on that train and we came here, just the women and children. And it was that Reverend Benjamin Thomas over at that yonder big white church, First Baptist Church of Elgin. He helped us to find a place to stay and make sure that we were safe until the menfolk came the following year. Reverend Thomas, he the one that got that train for us. He the one that arranged that freedom train for us to get on. Now my son-in-law was Arthur Newsom. He real famous around here. Arthur Newsom, that's Minerva's husband. He came here in 1863 with the other menfolk, and he helped all the coloreds get some place to stay, and he helped start a school for the colored children. I stayed with my daughter Minerva and him the whole time I was here, up on Ann Street over yonder. Do y'all know where that is? Ann Street over yonder, that's Ann and Hickory. That's where all the colored folks live. It's called the settlement, because we settled there. And I cleaned white folks' houses here because that's all I knowed how to do. Now, I was a slave for 65 years, I told you, and I worked in the fields picking cotton, but eventually Missy Rutland wanted me in the big house. And I came in the big house and I started cleaning the house for them. Now, it was hard work, but my husband and my daughters and I, we made the best of it we could. We did the best we could with what we had to work with. But one day, my husband got sold away to another plantation. And I ain't never seen him since. It's just been me and my daughters ever since. But I got a secret I'm gonna tell you. When I got moved to the big house and I was cleaning there, and that day I knew I was leaving that night. I knew I was running away. And I was in the house cleaning, and I looked over on that buffet and I saw Missy Rutland's ring. And I stole it. I took that ring for them taking my husband and selling him away. And for all that work I did, I took that ring, I stole that ring. And it's pretty too, ain't it? I know it's worth some money. I know it's worth some money. Well, when I came here, I was cleaning houses, but I also helped the colored folks who kept coming to Elgin after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And they got settled here, and Arthur got a good deal on some land, and he bought land, and he built houses and sold the houses to the new freed slaves that came to Elgin. In our little community, it was growing fast. Now, Reverend Thomas and the good folk over at First Baptist Church, they kept being a good help to us. All told, they brought about 125 of us here, and we was the colored community. We was the settlement. And eventually, me and my son-in-law, Arthur, we started the Second Baptist Church of Elgin. Have y'all heard of that church? Anybody heard of that church? Is it still around here? Yeah, I think so. And all the children in the settlement, they all went to the colored school. But it was kind of far away, and that building was broke down. It was so raggedy. It wasn't no good for children to be learning in. And it was so dangerous for the children to be in that building. So Arthur got some folk together, and we signed a petition. We signed a petition, and we took it to Elgin City Council too. And we told them, we are taxed in proportion to our means to support and build all the public schools around here, and we ought to have the privilege of using them like everybody else. Yes, we did tell them that. It took some time, but you know what? Eventually we won. We got our way. And Elgin abandoned them segregated schools in 1872. I bet you didn't know that. So then our children got to go to the good, safe school with the white children. Now, it was still segregated at the school, but we were in the same building and it was safe for the children to go to. We were so happy. Now, I had a good life here in Elgin for the times. It was hard times for colored folk, but we had a good life. We made the best of it. And the only thing missing from my good life was a man, a good man. But I've seen this handsome soldier over yonder there. And I'm wondering, I sure would like to meet him. I'm wondering if one of y'all would do me a favor and give him this piece of paper if you going that way. Now, I never did learn to read and write, but somebody wrote this for me, and it says, "Dear soldier man, you sure look fine in that uniform. And if you hungry and you come by here tonight, I'll fix you some greens and cornbread." Anybody? Any volunteers willing to give this to him? Somebody? Anybody? What, ma'am, will you give that to him? Are you sure you're going to give it to him?
I'm sure. If he's all that handsome.
He's a handsome man. I saw him. Now, you ask him if he's married first, because if he married, don't give it to him, because I ain't no home wrecker. Okay. Thank you so much. I sure appreciate it. I sure appreciate y'all coming by to meet me today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Glad to have some company. My name is Levi Tennant. I was born in Alabama on March 3rd, 1847. I was born a slave but died a free, proud man. I joined the Army's Union forces on March 31st, 1864. I was a member of the Alabama 4th Infantry Regiment, which was renamed the 106th United States Colored Troops. I served in a garrison unit until the end of the Civil War. Then I came to Elgin after the war and lived until my death on March 29th, 1883. Did you know that there were colored men in the Union Army? Well, let me tell you about the war. When the Civil War started, we mostly couldn't join. But when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, we all could join. Before then, the Army was mostly white men. By the summer of 1862, more and more of us ex-slaves started joining. You know why? Well, the truth is that the Union casualties were mounting fast. So white soldiers were more willing to allow black participation because they were running out of bodies. But we were put in separate regiments called the African Descendant Regiments. The term colored soon replaced that term and became universal when the Army federalized the regiments into the United States Colored Troops. About 75% of us were slaves, either runaways or slaves who volunteered to serve in exchange for their freedom. The slave owners had to let us join, but they got $100 compensation to give up their slave. The colored troops were issued the same uniforms, weapons, and rations as the white soldiers. Although we like to think it was because we were accepted as equals, the truth is that it was just plain cheaper to provide us standard equipment than to issue different uniforms and equipment. Most colored regiments guarded supply lines, served as prison guards, and hunted Confederate guerrillas. Railroad guards protected bridges and railroad tunnels and road supply trains to protect them from raiders. Garrison troops like mine protected towns, forts, and supply posts. Those were hard times for all colored men, but those of us in the Army generally fared better later in life than those who were civilians. We still faced racism, but the training we had and the leadership experiences gave us skills we used after the war. So, when I came to Elgin in 1864, after the war, I could always get work because of my Army training. It felt good to be able to provide for my wife and children. I married, I had 5 children, but in March 1877, my 2-year-old daughter died, and then in July 1881, another daughter, Betsy, died. She was only 18 months old. Me and my wife were real sad, of course, but my Second Baptist Church family and our neighbors over in the settlement really helped us, and the good Lord saw us through it. The settlement is the area of town where all the colored folks lived. We were a real close community. We looked out for each other, and we stuck together. The settlement was a whole life. We socialized with each other there because we couldn't go up into town to the restaurants or any entertainment. Plus, we couldn't afford it anyway. But we had a good life there. We had picnics, parties, neighborhood games, and socials. Our kids went to the colored school, which wasn't fit for kids because the building was in bad shape. So Mr. Newsom and me and some others got a petition together and took it to the city council to tell them that we paid taxes like everybody else to support all the public schools, so we should get to use them too. Eventually, we got our way, and our kids started attending school with the white kids in a safer building. When I died in 1883 of lung cancer, of lung disease, I left behind my wife and 3 of my kids who were still living. But I know the good Lord and my neighbors in the settlement helped them out. That's how things were in the settlement. We looked out for each other. Now, I hear there is a young lady out here who likes a man in uniform and wants to cook me a good dinner. Have you met her yet? You have, okay. If I didn't know better, I would think she was trying to flirt with me. She's quite a bit younger than myself, but I'm sure thinking about taking her up on that meal. So if you see her, tell her I'll come calling real soon. I appreciate you guys coming by to meet me. Come back anytime. Thanks.
My name is George M. Peck, and this is my mausoleum right here in the background. I was born in Dundee in 1842. At the age of 13, I went to work in a dry goods store in Dundee. And in 1861, I answered President Lincoln's call for soldiers to serve in the Civil War. I served in the Civil War until the end as a supply sergeant in the 58th Illinois. Upon the end of the Civil War, I came back to Elgin and again went back to work in a dry goods store. And in 1881, I was able to open my own dry goods store, and I named it Peck's. It was very successful. In the early 1900s, a young man from Elgin bought it named Joseph Speece. Does anybody remember Joseph Speece? He became a very influential Elgin citizen. Being out of dry goods, I was looking around for another business to be involved in, and I went into windmills. The Elgin Wind Power and Pump Company had been operating in Elgin since 1882. I bought into the business and became president. In 1921, my son Richard decided to build a house across the street from what is now Larkin High School. And we put one of my windmills up at Richard's house to supply water for that house as it was outside city limits. That windmill stood there until 2004 when it was taken down by the Elgin Area Historical Society. It was restored and was put into storage until we could find a suitable site to put it up on. With Foundry Park becoming a green space recently, we decided to put the windmill up in Foundry Park because that was the site of my factory. Elgin Wind Power and Pump stood right on that site. So if you go by Foundry Park, right on Route 31, in between Kimball Street and Highland, you'll see my windmill standing there, and it is standing in the exact site it was built on. Any other questions? You're free to take a look into my mausoleum. People tell me it's beautiful. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, welcome to Blooms. Blooms was a very important piece of downtown Elgin. Here's our lunch menu. Check that out for a few moments. Does anybody here remember Blooms? Oh, good, very good. Oh, very good. So those of you that are lucky enough to remember it can step back through your memories and sort of bring the place back up to life. And the rest of you, I invite you to come with your imagination, come over the threshold and come into Blooms. Blooms was a very important piece of Elgin history for 7 decades. But I am not the Mr. Bloom that you probably remember. That is my son, Edmund Bloom. He was the face of Blooms for many years. His life at Blooms spanned a half a century. So many people remember Edmund, although we did resemble one another quite a bit, much to his credit, I might say. But I'm ahead of myself, so let me start back at the beginning, because every sweet story requires the ingredients to be brought in and mixed in the proper fashion. And my story begins in Germany in 1872. My family was in the confectionery business, and when I was sent to America at the age of 16, I came to Elgin. Now that was quite a leap for a 16-year-old boy, but my sister Minnie was already here in Elgin and had married, and there were plenty of German-speaking people in Elgin at that time. About 25% of the population was either German-born or children of German-born. And so German language was widely spoken. And that asset helped to transition me from the old country into becoming an American. It's a great asset. Well, I went to work straight away for the Schramm brothers, another good German family, and they ran a confectionery store in downtown Elgin, 15 Douglas Avenue. And there I learned the trade of candy making and confectionery and all the things that rounded me out from what I just picked up as a child in Germany. And I learned how to make ice cream, which we only made during the summer months in those days. People just didn't buy ice cream after about October. They weren't interested in it because you had to go to a confectionery store to get it. You couldn't buy it at a grocery store, and you couldn't store it at home. And why was that? Because there was no refrigeration. They had ice boxes, but ice boxes weren't cold enough to keep ice cream solid. So people bought ice cream at confectionery stores in those days. I took over the business from the Schramms when they retired in 1896. And a few years later, I married my beloved Anna. And a few years after that, my son Edmund was born. And business was good for us, and we continued to operate the confectionery, and we served beautiful little children like yourself. And after my son Edmund graduated from high school in 1916, he really became the public face of Blooms. He was the guy who was out in front taking care of the fountain. And I did that too, of course. But as a businessman, I began to look for other opportunities to expand. And a great opportunity came to me in 1917. And that was Prohibition. Now, you might say, 1917, Prohibition was 1919. But in Elgin, Prohibition came 2 years earlier. And does anybody know why? It's because women were given the right to vote in local elections in 1916. And in the very next election cycle, the township went dry. And that was the end of all the taverns in downtown Elgin. And with them went all of the lunch trade. And so the great business opportunity presented itself for me as a young businessman. And we began to expand into the lunch trade. And that was successful. It was a good place for businessmen and downtown shoppers to get a quick bite. And lunch quickly led to supper. And as sure as night follows day, breakfast followed supper. And within a few years, we are offering a full breakfast, lunch, and supper menu, as well as the confectionaries, and as well as all our ice cream, which by that time we had 12 flavors. 12. Why would you need more than 12? We had 12 flavors. So the combined business kept us going during the 20s and in through the Depression, and did very well for us. But it also created the ingredients that made Bloom's what it is in the minds of those of you that remember, and I hope in the minds of you that are now visiting Bloom's. Because what happened was, Bloom's became a store where people of all age levels came. Children came with their parents, workers came, high school kids came, parents brought their kids back when they had kids, grandparents came. And so through multiple generations and in multiple iterations, they came for the restaurant, they came for the candies, they came for the ice cream. And people used Bloom's little by little, many, many times over many, many years. And that helped bring it all together into their memories as a sweet, pleasant place where their families would meet and interact. And so Bloom's went on all the way up until 1964, when Edmund, after a half a century in that store, decided to retire. The people of Elgin came and they bought the glassware and the plates from Bloom's because they wanted that little tangible memory of the place. That great thing that you now call nostalgia, which as best as I could tell, is that sort of sweet and slightly intoxicating mix of memory and emotion that kind of swirls around something. That became Bloom's. And then now it's part for you to take away. That part of Elgin history, that part of Bloom's history. Now, before I let you go, I want to say one thing I always tell people. To always remember in life that there is nothing more fun than eating ice cream. Let that guide you as you go forth in life. Thank you for coming by. Would you like a peppermint, a cinnamon? Anyone like a cinnamon or a butterscotch?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for being here. My name is Annie Talent. My birthday is April 27th, 1827. Wow. My birth name was Anna Donna Frazier. Never did like that name. Never did like the name Anna. And when I became an adult, I had it legally changed to Annie. I was one of 11 children that was born to Don and Margaret Frazier out in Livingston County, New York. I was the 10th child. And we lived on a 170-acre farm. It was a wonderful way for us to grow up. We came into a family of aristocrats. We were well educated. My father was a deacon at the church where I was baptized, and eventually our church became a Presbyterian affiliation. Now, my two older brothers, once they received their education, traveled out west and settled here in Illinois. One became a lawyer and the other a professor. Now, I was a bit of a mystery woman, according to some, because there's no documentation of what happened after my formal education until I married my husband, David Talent, in 1854. When I was 36 years old, I gave birth to our one and only child. His name was Robert. He was the apple of my eye, and I had no trouble telling every single person I came in contact with how wonderful my son was. Now, David, when we traveled here and settled in Elgin, David became a lawyer here in town, and he also was a blacksmith. Interesting. Things were very tough back then. There was a bit of a depression going on, and men were looking for work to support their families. But there was this talk of getting rich quick and gold mining in the hills, the Black Hills of South Dakota. It was quite the talk, and I'll tell you that David caught gold fever. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Custer was planning a secret expedition right here in Chicago, and David caught wind of it. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Black Hills of South Dakota. See, it was a native area. The Native American Indians, the Sioux Indians, had a treaty preventing any white settlement in that area. You see, the Black Hills were sacred grounds to the gods of these Indians, and that needed to be protected. So there was a treaty in place not allowing any white settlement. There were outposts where whites were allowed to live, but nothing on the sacred grounds of the Black Hills. But that's where the gold was. So the plans for exploration continued, and my husband David was one of 26 men that went on this first expedition. I wanted to go too, and so my son Robert, who was 9 at the time, had no choice. There were now 26 men, a woman, and a little boy. And in October of 1874, we began our journey in Covington, Nebraska. We had 6 buggies, but we went by foot mostly, taking turns walking, because we had to protect our animals. We had to have the buggies used for supplies and for food. And I will tell you, the food was very unpleasant. Many cold biscuits and limp flapjacks were eaten on this journey. I will tell you, though, that in leaving from Nebraska in October, it was a beautiful day like today. It was wonderful for traveling, a great way to begin our journey. And it was beautiful, the wilderness of Nebraska, the golden grasses, made it fun for travel. In the evenings, we'd sit around the campfire and sing songs, and well, I was known for my storytelling. The worst part of our journey was when we reached the Badlands. There was very little water to be had there, and as our caravan of buggies went through, it kicked up dirt, causing our eyes to become red and our throats to be dry. It was very difficult, but we made our way through. And on December 23rd of that year, we landed at the French Creek in the Black Hills of South Dakota, a day I'll never forget. The men immediately began building a stockade to protect us from the Sioux Indians so that we would have a place to settle and let the mining begin. And they searched and they finally found it the following April. But it was very short-lived because shortly thereafter a cavalry was sent in to remove us, and they took us to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where we stayed for a couple of years. Now this experience was enough to let me know that I wanted to live in this beautiful place for the rest of my life, and so we did. And I became a teacher. For the next 10 years, I taught and I began writing. Many people wanted me to recollect my memories of what it was like during our traveling time, and so I started writing. And as we were moving around in little mining communities there, and I was teaching, of course my favorite student was Robert. I enjoyed our days there, and if I might, would you like me to read a little excerpt from one of my writings?
Yeah.
Just a couple of my memories from the trip. A wearied and worn, tattered and torn combination for sure. On reaching French Creek on the 23rd day of December, 1874. I was painfully aware that I, at least, was in a very sorry plight. My shoes were in a very demoralized condition. What did I do for shoes? Why, I made a pair of moccasins of deerskin that had been tanned by one of the boys, and very comfortable moccasins they were. Had it not been for certain precautions on our way into the hills, some would have been barefoot long before reaching the end of the journey. We bound our feet with gunny sacks, and a stout cord keeping them in place. You'll recall I said we left in October and we arrived on December 23rd. Christmas morn dawned upon us, and at no time since our journey began did we realize, both by distance and environment, that we were so very far away from home and all that home implies. No Merry Christmas greetings from the loved ones, no sweet sounds from the chimes of Christmas bells falling on our ears, no church privileges. But wait, was not the whole expanse a church? Grander by far than any cathedral built by human hands. These were my thoughts that rose up in my mind as I sat musing from the opening of my tent on that Christmas day. Our beautiful patriotic tent. It was red, white, and blue. And because of me, we lost it. It was my turn to mind the campfire, and I nodded off, and the wind gust took our tent. So many memories. When Robert had become a young man, we traveled back to Elgin one more time. This was 1887. We came to visit my brother and sister, Margaret, who was named after our mother, and over here, Alexander, my brother. Coincidentally, the three of us all passed when we were 73 years old, and Brother Donald lived to be 76. So many memories, and it was wonderful that Robert had the opportunity to meet one of his aunts and uncles. Now, when we returned to South Dakota, we discovered that Robert's father had left us forever. But that was okay. And in closing, I want you to know that there was a monument erected, and I was so honored on my behalf, by the Society of Black Hills Pioneers. It says Anna Donna Talent, buried in Bluff City Cemetery, Elgin, Illinois. The inscription reads, "The first white woman to enter the Black Hills. The world is a better place because she lived and worked in it." There were more than 3 schools named in my name. And in 1899, I finally published my book, 2 years before my death, The Black Hills, the Last Hunting Ground of the Dakotas. And you can read this book, as there is a copy of it, at the Gail Borden Library in Elgin. Thank you so much for coming today.